Good morning, class. This is the history of rock and roll, commonly known as Funkadelic Acid Blues, and I am your teacher, your professor. I am the doctor, and today we are going to talk about the first R in rock and roll. You probably think that the first R in rock and roll stands for rock. You would be wrong, because we're working with my brain. My brain says the first R in rock and roll is for radio. And I'm not going to get into Clark Maxwell and Hertz and Tesla, who all basically came up with the concept and the understanding of what radio was and how it worked, even though they didn't know how to work it yet. That didn't come until Marconi sent a Morse code, and this is a very important part. He sent Morse code across radio waves. Well, you really couldn't call it radio because it wasn't a complete signal. It was what they called stopgap, which means, when the signal was on, it was on. When it was off, it was off. And that's all you could do was, like binary code, which they didn't have yet. But I'm getting off in the weeds. No, in 1906, Fessington finally figured it out that you had to use what is commonly in your car called an alternator, and he had to make a very gigantic alternator, and that alternator created the radio wave. And then you took your microphone, and I don't ask me questions. I don't know how it combined it. I mean, I know it used capacitors and diodes and all that stuff, but it blends the radio signal and the music signal. And the music, well, the radio signal, let's just say, that's the wave. And the alternator, was the surfboard. And, and it wasn't till many years later that people like Foster Brooks and Henry Aloysius Nevins III and all the other great WKBW DJs that I grew up with, they rode the board. And so in 1906, Fessington got this gigantic alternator set up, and he sent a message. And at the time, the only people that had radio receivers usually were people in the radio room of a ship, and they were listening to Morse code signals because Marconi had gotten that far. And so before he set out to broadcast, he basically sent a message in Morse code: be ready for some serious shit. Now, apparently they didn't use those exact words, but you get the idea. And it was Christmas Eve, 1906. And all the radio operators and other people on the ship gathered for what was to come, and what was to come was the first voice transmission on radio, and it was amplitude modulation, amplitude modulation, which is alternating current, because they used an alternator. You see what I'm saying? Now, what did they hear? It was Christmas Eve. They heard a violin and a woman and a young child singing "O Holy Night." And AM radio was born. Now, the first broadcast didn't happen yet. No, that wasn't until in the 20s when the first radio broadcast came about. And what they did, that was ingenious. And and here's a picture of the first radio station. Now you can see the turntable and how the turntable has, if you look close, it's got a horn on it that points to the microphone, because that's as far as the signal could go in the room. And then they sent that microphone signal to the transmitter and to the antenna, and then they broadcast to their fans, which they called hammies. And these little hammies, they called them hammies because most of this was for kids. It was broadcast as a kids show because they knew the kids knew how to make crystal radios, or what we call ham radios. And they, so all these kids in the 20s were making, their crystal sets, and, it's real easy to do. Anybody can do it. You just need some copper wire, tin foil, and I think I have tin foil in the house. And I know I got tons of copper wire. Of course, most of it is trying to get this signal right and screwing up all my lights all the time, but not important. Anyway, moving right along. So AM radio, they broadcast once a week, every Wednesday night at a certain time. I think it was like 6:30 or something. But all these kids would get their homemade radios and they'd tune it to this. And then, once the parents figured out what was going on, they were like, hey, build me one. And then, this is the time when AM radio won out. And even though it was a lesser quality signal, it was cheaper, and any idiot could make an AM radio. Because Tesla was the king of the wireless system. He also predicted that one day we will have 0-point energy, which we have not figured out how to do yet, at least outside of Area 51. But eventually we will have 0-point energy, and Exxon will go bankrupt. But that's another story. And this is kind of the end of this story. Well, this is the middle section of this story, because I'm going to add this on to the next week. I'm going to talk about AM and rock and roll. I just, today was kind of a rock and roll free, rock and roll history lesson, because sometimes you have to go backwards. And the first commercial radio station was KDA in Pittsburgh. Yes, so once again, Pennsylvania started everything. Just saying. You know, they don't call Pennsylvania the Keystone State for nothing. We're the key of everything. But next week, I'm going to talk about rock and roll radio and the hip DJs, and this is going to be one of my favorite shows because as a kid, I wanted to be a DJ. I thought that that was the coolest job in the world, to sit there in a room all by yourself, no distractions, just you and the microphone, and you get to play everybody your favorite music and tell them a little bit about them, and so, well, my point is, my point is, I'm going to, what was my point?